In September this year, it was alleged that an Iranian criminal network, which targets dissidents on behalf of the Iranian government, contacted two members of the Outlaw Motorcycle Club, the Hells Angels. Their goal? To arrange for the assassination of an Iranian dissident living in the US. The discussion between the alleged assailants was intercepted on the encrypted communications network Sky-ECC. The indictment in a US court showed that two members of Hells Angels agreed to carry out murder for hire for $350,000 and $20,000 in travel expenses. In Canada, outlaw motorcycle clubs, often referred to as a 1% club, include infamous names like the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, and Bandidos. The Hells Angels are reported to have over 450 chapters across almost 60 countries around the world, and many of those chapters are in Canada. According to Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, outlaw motorcycle gangs are involved in a range of illicit markets: fraud, counterfeiting, money laundering, extortion, corruption, drug trafficking, illegal firearms trafficking, violence, and murder. In terms of the Global Organized Crime Index, outlaw motorcycle gangs are considered mafia-style groups. A score of 5 out of 10, like in Canada's case, might not be striking at first glance to those who are familiar with the OC Index, but considering the rest of the country's profile, it is a notable outlier. Canada has very high levels of resilience to organized crime, with a score of 7.21 out of 10, placing it 23rd globally. On the other side of the coin, it has low levels of criminality, 3.88 out of 10, making it 160 out of 193 countries. The overall criminal actor score is only 3.9 out of 10. So at 5 out of 10, mafia-style groups are actually the country's highest form of criminal actor. And outlaw motorcycle gangs are the most widespread form in Canada. The province of Nova Scotia is of particular interest due to its port of entry for illegal drugs. I'm delighted to welcome Connor King, Detective Inspector at Victoria Police Department, where he is the officer in charge of the Investigative Services Division. He leads multiple teams, including the Major Crime Unit, Forensic Identification, Analysis and Criminal Intelligence, and Strikeforce Covert Operations Team. Connor, welcome to the Index.
Thank you very much.
Now, for those of us that aren't familiar, could you give us a brief outline on who the major outlaw motorcycle clubs in Canada are and when they emerged?
Yes, there are really 4 major outlaw motorcycle clubs in Canada. The Hells Angels being likely the one that most people have heard of. They arrived in the 1970s, and most people are maybe familiar with the origin of the Hells Angels in that they were born out of the post-Second World War era in California, largely air crews from fighter bombers came back to the United States, still had this desire to be living on the edge, and formed these initially motorcycle clubs, which then turned into criminal motorcycle clubs, grew through the 60s and then into Canada in the 70s. We also see in Canada the Outlaws, the Bandidos, and the Mongols. These groups essentially arrived, the second and third groups arrived through the 1990s and in the 2000s.
That's really interesting. Obviously, I have heard of Hells Angels, but I actually didn't know that background. So that's really helpful. Now, which areas of Canada are they most active in, and why is that?
There's 3 provinces where we see the most outlaw motorcycle club activity: British Columbia on the west coast, and then Ontario and Quebec further east. Basically, the outlaw motorcycle clubs operate with the most success in our densest urban areas. For instance, the city of Vancouver on the Pacific coast has a large number of chapters just in and around the city of Vancouver. Likely, it's because there's great access to the port of Vancouver. So there's opportunity to make money by shipping illegal items through the ports. There's also fantastic access to the US market because Vancouver is very close to the US border. Likewise, with southern Ontario and parts of Quebec, where there is, again, large shipping facilities, and they are in very close proximity to the US border because moving drugs and other items back and forth across the US border is one of the primary ways that they make money. But they also do have chapters through some of the other provinces, but those three areas are where we see the most activity.
Now, Connor, do you think there is a misconception around the size and power of these clubs? Because from what you've just described, they appear to be, huge transnational organized criminal groups.
They're kind of a bit of both. They are, at least on some levels or at some times or with some individuals, operating at the international level. So outlaw motorcycle clubs are not really homogeneous. There are different chapters in different provinces. They operate with greater sophistication. And so let's, for instance, talk about the motorcycle clubs, the Hells Angels, that operate in and around Vancouver. They've been well linked to some international drug trafficking that connects them with organized crime groups in Asia, moving large amounts of, say, precursor drugs, precursor chemicals for fentanyl production into British Columbia. They've also been linked to Mexican cartels moving cocaine from South America all the way into North America. So certainly they have international connections, whereas other chapters of outlaw motorcycle clubs across the country really only have local influence. So I guess the answer is it all depends on which chapter you're talking about. But certainly, as you mentioned in your introduction, there are also outlaw motorcycle clubs globally. And they are all able to communicate and connect. The Hells Angels in Canada certainly talk to and work with the Hells Angels in the United States or in Australia, for instance, or in parts of the EU. But there is no global command or global structure. They can cooperate for a few months and then terminate their level of cooperation because there's no financial advantage at that time. And then they'll just move on to other opportunities.
So, Connor, in the introduction, I quoted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as explaining that, these gangs are involved in a range of illicit markets. It would be great if you could sort of elaborate a little bit more on, what they do and what they're involved in.
They are involved in whatever illicit market appears most profitable at the time, but there is no doubt that drug trafficking is their primary source of revenue. And most of their diversification is in what form of drug do they happen to be involved in at that particular time. And this evolves as markets ebb and flow and drugs become more or less available. So, for instance, cannabis in Canada has predominantly been a huge market for organized crime. We obviously have legalized cannabis here. It's our 6th year of legalized cannabis. But prior to that, particularly, outlaw motorcycle clubs were heavily involved in operating grow operations, whether they were small or factory size and large, producing cannabis plants themselves, or at least with affiliates, or they were taxing or extorting money from people who were trying to grow cannabis. Biker gangs would find out somebody is growing cannabis, and then they would insert themselves into the operation and say, in order for your grow operation to continue, you'll have to pay the Hells Angels, for instance, a tax, or something nefarious will happen to your illegal grow. So that was an area where they made a lot of money. They are still likely involved in cannabis production, even though we have a legalized market, but some of their share has definitely been reduced. So, of course, they've pivoted into other areas. They're heavily involved in moving cocaine from South America into Canada, and they're working very well in great levels of cooperation with Mexican cartels to facilitate that. They're also heavily involved in moving precursors from China into Canada and other parts of North America in order to facilitate fentanyl production. Here in in Canada, we have domestic fentanyl production. And of course, fentanyl production also occurs in Mexico. So that is very, very profitable for outlaw motorcycle clubs. So drugs, I would say, is their primary form of revenue, but they're also involved in whatever else is opportunistic. So they run casinos, strip clubs, bars. They're involved in extortion operations, money laundering, um, firearms trafficking. There's really there's no illicit market that they won't get into, and they might stay for a while, then move on to other opportunities. But again, by far, drugs has always been their biggest revenue driver.
Now, there's also evidence, isn't there, that these clubs have actually worked with other organized criminal groups or networks around the world, like the Nandarangita or the Rizzuto crime family. What does that relationship look like today?
There is solid evidence that for decades they will find opportunities to work with, whether it's the Italian mafia, the Rizzuto family in Montreal, as an example, or more recently, they're very active working with global China-based organized crime groups, like whether it's a 14K, or in Western Canada, we have a group called the Big Circle Gang. They have actually done a good job in putting away a lot of the grievances and finding opportunities to cooperate rather than to conflict with other groups. And that's not just unique to outlaw motorcycle clubs. It's actually a phenomenon we're seeing more and more with organized crime groups around the world, where there's so much money to be made, and almost like the leadership is using a little bit more of sophisticated or thoughtful thinking, and they're deciding that let's all just have a piece of the market. We can all make money if we all engage in some level of cooperation. And outlaw motorcycle clubs are no exception. So we see them, as I mentioned, engage with China based organized crime groups to move fentanyl at times, or other novel psychoactive substances or precursors. Or, as I mentioned, they're working with Mexican cartels. Now, sometimes there is conflict and somebody does end up dead. There's always going to be that level of violence and organized crime. There is a lot of infighting, backstabbing, and deals gone wrong. But the cooperation is actually that troubles me far more.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds both fascinating and frightening at the same time. Now, another interesting thing is that these outlaw motorcycle clubs claim to do charity work in the communities, right? But what exactly is the truth behind this claim, and how do Canadians see and respond to these gangs?
Yes, so outlaw motorcycle clubs have a long history of, I would call it, flirting with opportunities to do charitable work. One of their trademark charitable work operations looks like toys for kids, maybe at Christmas, toys for kids that are underprivileged, or toys for kids that are in hospital, etc. That's essentially their brand, is delivering toys for kids. I would say that they're only fooling themselves. Nobody really thinks that this is a benevolent and purely selfless act of charity. It is pretty transparent that this is just a PR operation run by a group that is widely considered to be engaged in organized crime at both the community level and at the global level. And so they do seemingly have this desire to get better PR. I mean, outlaw motorcycle clubs are very different. If you think about it for a second, they're one of the only organized crime groups that actively wear jackets that identify themselves as members of the organized crime group, because of course they will assert that they're not an organized crime group. But they will have rides where they will bring hundreds of members in from other provinces or other states or other chapters, and they will have a day of riding from point A to point B. It could be several hundred kilometers, all advertising that they're members of these different outlaw motorcycle club chapters. That's a very unique crime group. And so when they're putting themselves out there, they at the same time have to put out an image that they are good citizens. But again, as I started as I said earlier, I really think they're only fooling themselves. The vast majority of citizens kind of roll their eyes and say, "Sure, yeah, thanks for bringing toys for kids, but could you stop actually bringing cocaine from Mexico?"
Now, according to the OC Index, Canada has very high levels of resilience to organized crime. But like you just said, there's also this extremely visible, you know, groups like the Outlaw Motorcycle Clubs, like you said, with their jacket and the insignia and being very, very public as being a member of these groups. So, what has been the response to these clubs from Canadian law enforcement, and has it actually been successful?
It has been successful. The successes are not at the cadence that police in Canada would like, but they have been frequent enough that I would say if you're a member of an outlaw motorcycle club, you need to be really thinking about whether you're vulnerable to police interaction or interdiction. So some of the successes have looked like are the arrests of actual full-fledged patched in members of biker gangs who are hands on bringing cocaine again into Canada, typically from Mexico. There's been a good number of high profile members arrested, charged with conspiracy to import cocaine. We've also seen members that became involved in murder plots or actual hands on actions of violence where they too have been arrested. It seems like there used to be a concept that outlaw motorcycle clubs were a bit more of the untouchables, and that has not proven to be the case of late. Part of that is that the police do have levels of sophistication when it comes to intercepting information, sophisticated surveillance operations, and there's been a lot of investment in specialized police teams to tackle outlaw motorcycle clubs, and those investments have paid off. But one thing that's worth mentioning, what's also happened is in Canada, there's been the use of what's called civil forfeiture laws, where the governments can bring the outlaw motorcycle clubs to court and launch a court action to seize assets, seize clubhouses. So in British Columbia and Western Canada, recently 3 Hells Angels clubs where they were running their weekly church meetings, they call them church meetings, those clubs were seized years ago. There were court actions that took place over more than a decade. And finally, those clubhouses were granted to the government, which are now being sold off. So it's somewhat of a symbolic victory, but it shows that these outlaw motorcycle clubs are certainly touchable by law enforcement.
Last question. In your view, what more do you think needs to be done to curb the influence of these gangs?
There are a few things that are happening, and there's more that needs to be done. An investment that's occurring in Canada is to actually reduce the size of outlaw motorcycle clubs and also other organized crime groups by stopping the recruitment of young people into the gangs in the first place. And that's essentially showing the lifestyle of criminals and gangsters for what it really is, as opposed to what it might look like in a movie or what it might sound like when a young person who could be easily influenced meets somebody in a bar and they say, like, I can make you super rich. All you got to do is deliver some packages for me. We show them that once you enter into the organized crime lifestyle, it's a world of paranoia, violence, intimidation, and short lifespans. So that's one avenue. The other avenue is, as I mentioned, strong investment in specialized teams. It's very challenging for a police department that doesn't have investment in specialized teams to tackle organized crime. Organized crime requires organized policing. Canada has seen the stand up of a lot of national and provincial teams solely focused on tackling particularly violent crime groups and also crime groups involved in a high level of drug trafficking. So we can't put the battle against organized crime on autopilot. It takes constant re-energizing and innovations. And that's what Canada has been successfully doing. More would be better, but it's certainly on the right path.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Index, and a special thank you to Connor for being part of this discussion. You can learn more about criminality and resilience in Canada by visiting the website of the Global Organized Crime Index, ocindex.net.